In 1962, General Motors controlled more than half of every car sold in the United States. Ford and Chrysler held most of the rest. Between them, the Big Three owned roughly 82% of the domestic market. But just 18 years later, all three companies reported combined losses of $4 billion in a single year. 300,000 factory workers lost their jobs, and American buyers were flooding into Toyota and Honda dealerships for the first time. So what was the one mistake that handed the world's largest car market to Japan? It wasn't a single bad decision. It was arrogance, dressed up as confidence, repeated for so long that nobody in Detroit could tell the difference anymore. 18 years before those losses, the American auto industry operated like a kingdom with no enemies. General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler dominated not just the market, but the culture itself. The family car was an extension of the American dream, and Detroit was the factory that built it. Every fall brought new models with bigger fins, more chrome, and larger engines. Buyers lined up at dealerships like clockwork. Profits flowed quarter after quarter, and the men running these companies came to believe that they understood the American car buyer better than anyone on earth. There was a phrase for this mentality. Journalist Brock Yates, who wrote for Car and Driver magazine, called it Detroit Mind. He described a management culture that rewarded conformity over creativity, one that looked at the domestic market and saw a machine that would run forever without maintenance. The Big Three produced a limited number of models, usually variations of the same family sedan, and the changes from year to year were overwhelmingly cosmetic, from new paint colors and revised grille designs to slightly longer tail fins. After the basic technological configuration of the American car was locked in during the early 50s, the underlying engineering changed very little for nearly 2 decades. And why would it? General Motors alone held more than 50% of the market. Ford controlled nearly 30%. Those numbers made innovation feel unnecessary and risk feel pointless. If you're selling every car you build, what's the incentive to build a different kind of car? But here's the detail that everyone missed at the time. On the other side of the Pacific Ocean, something very different was taking shape inside Japanese factories. And the irony of what happened next still stings. After World War II, Japan's industrial base lay in ruins. Its car companies could barely produce 150,000 vehicles in 1960, a rounding error compared to Detroit's output. But Japanese manufacturers had one advantage that the Big Three would spend decades underestimating. They were willing to listen to an American who couldn't get a meeting in his own country. W. Edwards Deming was a statistician born in Sioux City, Iowa, who had spent years developing a system for improving manufacturing quality through data and continuous refinement. His core idea was that you could track defects, identify exactly where in the production process they originated, fix those root causes, and then keep refining until the system produced near-perfect results. He called the broader philosophy total quality management, and he was convinced it could transform any factory in any industry. American manufacturers weren't interested. In the booming post-war years, U.S. companies cared about volume, not precision. The assembly lines were humming, the cars were selling, and the money kept coming. Deming's theories about statistical quality control struck Detroit's executives as academic exercises. Interesting perhaps, but irrelevant to men riding the longest winning streak in industrial history. Why fix what isn't broken? Japan saw it completely differently. In 1950, the Japanese Union of Scientists and Engineers invited Deming to Tokyo to deliver a series of lectures to executives and factory managers. He spent extended periods in Japan throughout the late 40s and 50s, teaching quality control methods to engineers who took furious notes and implemented his ideas within weeks of hearing them. Japan already had a deep cultural tradition of meticulous craftsmanship, and with raw materials scarce in the post-war years, Eliminating waste wasn't just a philosophy. It was the difference between a factory surviving and a factory closing. Toyota took Deming's teachings further than anyone. Taiichi Ono, a production engineer at the company, combined Deming's statistical methods with an approach called just-in-time manufacturing, where parts arrived at the assembly line exactly when they were needed, not a day before and not a day after. This system evolved into the Toyota production system, and its results were extraordinary. Toyota's inventory costs eventually fell to roughly 1/10 of what General Motors was spending. American automotive engineers were awarding more top product quality honors to Japanese manufacturers than to domestic ones, and back in Detroit, almost nobody noticed. This decision to ignore what Japan was building might have been the most consequential blind spot in American business history. Detroit's executives knew Japanese cars existed. They knew about the emerging quality gap, but they waved it off because they believed deeply and stubbornly that American buyers would never choose a small, efficient, carefully assembled car over a full-sized American sedan. General Motors CEO Thomas Murphy captured this attitude perfectly. Even after the first oil crisis in 1973 pushed General Motors to consider downsizing its lineup, Murphy still insisted that big cars were, in his words, sensible machines for right-thinking Americans, while small cars were merely stopgap oddities designed for the underbelly of the market. That contempt for the compact car was the mistake, and what happened next proved just how costly that contempt would become. On October 17, 1973, the Arab members of OPEC announced an oil embargo against the United States. Within months, gasoline prices quadrupled. Lines at filling stations stretched around city blocks across the country. Rationing programs forced Americans to fill up on alternating days based on their license plate numbers. Families turned down their thermostats to 65 degrees and started carpooling to work. And overnight, the massive, fuel-hungry sedans and land yachts that Detroit had spent decades perfecting went from status symbols to liabilities, sitting unsold on dealer lots. American buyers needed small, fuel-efficient cars, and they needed them immediately. Detroit had almost nothing to give them. The Big Three had spent the previous decade pouring resources into bigger engines, heavier frames, and more elaborate styling packages. Compact cars had been treated as an afterthought, something thrown together cheaply for buyers who couldn't afford the real thing. And the oil embargo wasn't the only pressure bearing down on Detroit. The 1970 Clean Air Act had already imposed strict new emissions standards that American automakers were struggling to meet. The same companies that had neglected fuel efficiency had also neglected emissions technology. And now these same companies faced the task of complying with regulations that their own lobbyists had fought to delay. Japanese manufacturers, by contrast, had been investing in cleaner engine technology for years. When the regulations took effect, Honda was ready. Detroit was scrambling. What did Detroit do when backed into this corner? Did the Big Three pause, study what Japan was doing right, and commit to building competitive small cars? They did not. They panicked. Ford rushed the Pinto to market in just 25 months, barely half the standard 43-month development cycle for a new vehicle. The car was lightweight and affordable, but Ford's compressed timeline came with a terrible trade-off. The fuel tank sat in a position that left it dangerously vulnerable to rupturing in rear-end collisions. And when it ruptured, the results were catastrophic. Ford engineers identified the design flaw during development and proposed several fixes, including a nylon bladder lining that would have cost between $5 and $8 per car, or structural reinforcement at roughly $4 per vehicle. Management weighed the cost against projected savings and chose to ship the car as designed. The Pinto became synonymous with the phrase exploding car after a series of deadly fires in the mid-70s that triggered lawsuits, federal investigations, and one of the worst public relations disasters in American automotive history. What makes the Pinto story so telling is not just the engineering failure, it is the mindset behind it. Ford's own internal documents revealed a cost-benefit analysis that weighed the price of fixing the fuel tank against the estimated costs of lawsuits from burn injuries and deaths. The company concluded that paying for the lawsuits would be cheaper than fixing the car. That calculation said more about Detroit's priorities than any earnings report ever could. Chevrolet's answer was the Vega, which debuted to enthusiastic reviews and even won Motor Trend's Car of the Year. That praise evaporated fast. The Vega's aluminum engine block, designed without traditional steel cylinder liners in an effort to save weight, warped under heat, consumed oil at alarming rates, and frequently destroyed itself within a few years of normal driving. Rust chewed through the body panels. The fenders corroded. Owners joked bitterly that the car was dissolving underneath them. The vehicle that was supposed to prove Detroit could compete in the small car segment proved exactly the opposite. And these failures did not happen in isolation. They arrived at exactly the moment when American buyers were walking into showrooms and comparing the Pinto and the Vega to what Japan was displaying on the next lot over. How different would this story be if either of those cars had actually been good? If you've been enjoying this deep dive, consider subscribing. We break down the untold turning points in automotive history every week, and there's always more to the story. What Japan was displaying was the Honda Civic. In December of 1972, Honda's engineers achieved something that Detroit's entire research apparatus had called impossible. They passed the upcoming 1975 emissions standards set by the Environmental Protection Agency, and they managed it without relying on a catalytic converter. The technology was called CVCC, short for Compound Vortex Controlled Combustion, and it used a pre-combustion chamber in the cylinder head that allowed the engine to burn fuel far more cleanly and efficiently than anything coming out of American or European factories. The Civic CVCC became the EPA's top-rated car for fuel economy 4 years running. It could run on both leaded and unleaded gasoline, a meaningful advantage during a decade when fuel availability was unpredictable and consumers were anxious about every trip to the pump. Toyota told a parallel story with the Corolla, a compact sedan that sold over 7 million units worldwide by the end of the 70s. The Corolla wasn't flashy. It didn't make promises about performance or luxury. What it offered instead was something Detroit had stopped caring about, which was the expectation that a car would start every morning, get decent mileage, and not fall apart after 50,000 miles. Datsun, later known as Nissan, carved out its own loyal following with practical sedans and the sporty 240Z, a car that gave buyers European sports car performance at a fraction of the price. The numbers told the story more clearly than any magazine review. Japanese exports to the United States surged from fewer than 200,000 vehicles in 1968 to nearly 2 million by 1980. In 1970, Japanese brands accounted for just 1.4% of the American market. By 1979, they held roughly 21%. And the timing of what came next made everything worse for Detroit. In 1979, the Iranian Revolution cut off global oil supplies and triggered yet another fuel crisis. Gasoline prices spiked for the second time in 6 years. But this time, the shift in consumer behavior went deeper than panic buying. American drivers did not just consider Japanese cars as a stopgap measure, they started trusting them as permanent replacements for the vehicles Detroit was building. Consumer Reports and other automotive publications had been documenting what millions of owners were already experiencing firsthand. Japanese cars were not merely more fuel efficient. They broke down less often, needed fewer trips to the mechanic, and held their value on the resale market years longer than comparable American models. The phrase "made in Japan," which had implied cheap and disposable goods back in the 1950s, now carried a completely different meaning when stamped on an automobile. It meant reliability. The collapse of 1980 laid the full cost of Detroit's miscalculation bare. General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler lost a combined $4 billion in a single year. 300,000 auto workers were laid off from assembly plants across the Midwest. Another 500,000 workers at parts suppliers lost their livelihoods along with them. Japanese imports controlled more than 20% of the entire American car market, and every trend line pointed in one direction. The Reagan administration eventually negotiated voluntary export restraints with Japan in 1981, capping the number of vehicles Japanese manufacturers could ship to America each year. The idea was to give Detroit breathing room to retool and catch up, but Japanese automakers adapted to the restrictions in a way nobody in Washington anticipated. Honda opened its first American manufacturing plant in Marysville, Ohio in 1982, becoming one of the first foreign automakers to build cars on U.S. soil. Toyota expanded its operations in California. Nissan built a factory in Tennessee. By 1991, there were 13 foreign-operated motor vehicle assembly plants in the United States, up from just one in 1979. Rather than retreating, Japanese companies had planted roots in the country whose market they had come to dominate, hiring American workers and using the same quality-focused production systems that had given them the advantage in the first place. Detroit did eventually improve. Ford launched a genuine turnaround through the 80s and 90s with cars like the Taurus. Chrysler reinvented itself with the minivan. General Motors made slow, grinding progress over decades of painful restructuring. But the market share that the Big Three had lost never fully came back. And when gas prices spiked again in 2008, the cycle repeated itself. With truck and SUV sales collapsing, and a former AMC chairman telling reporters, "In the early 70s, we were caught flat-footed without smaller, fuel-efficient cars. That's exactly what's happening now." General Motors' dominance eroded from over 50% in the early 60s to roughly 17% by the 21st century. Toyota and Honda became permanent fixtures of the American automotive landscape, and they'd built that permanence on a foundation that Detroit had handed to them. The strangest thread in this entire story is the Deming connection. The quality revolution that reshaped Japanese manufacturing and allowed Toyota to outperform General Motors was built on ideas developed by an American, taught to Japanese engineers because American executives couldn't be bothered to listen. Deming didn't become well known in his own country until the early 1980s, when NBC aired a documentary titled, "If Japan Can, Why Can't We?" By that point, Toyota had already been winning the Deming Prize, a quality award that Japan had named after the man Detroit had overlooked. The mistake was never about one car, one executive, or one oil crisis. It was about an industry so dominant that it forgot the most basic rule of competition. The moment you stop getting better is the moment someone else starts catching up. Detroit had every advantage, every resource, and every warning sign imaginable. And the choice, year after year, was to keep building what had always sold rather than building what the future demanded. By the time that future arrived, the Honda Civic was already parked in their customers' driveways. If this is a chapter of automotive history you think more people should understand, the next video on screen explores how one company's manufacturing philosophy quietly reshaped the way cars are built around the world.